Hi, thanks for coming to the Sewing and Learning Workshop at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. My name is Amy Huffnagel, and I'm the Director of Programs and Visitor Experience, and I'm excited to be here today with Dr. Shirley Wajda, who has over 30 years of experience working in university teaching, public humanities, museum curatorships, historical writing, and editing. She earned her Ph.D. in American Civilization at the University of Pennsylvania and has now been selected to lead the Enfield Shaker Museum since 2019. We turned to Dr. Wajda specifically because of her interest and scholarship in the area of women's fashion, and again, specifically, or more specifically, around the fashion ideas of fashion as protest, including her work collecting and exhibiting the very first famed pussy hat into a museum collection in the United States, and generally working in classrooms, museums, and professional organizations to ensure that women and women's material culture is part of the historic record. So it's such a pleasure to have you here with us to talk about pockets and pouches and pocket pouches. And we welcome this conversation and learning with you today.
Thank you, Amy. It's always a pleasure to work with you folks at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, and this has been a fun project on pockets and pouches and other handbags and reticules, and it's been eye-opening for me to take another look at it. So what I'm going to do is do the infamous share screen and hope that it works. And there we are, I think.
Great.
Okay, terrific. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of pockets and kind of think about it not in only the sort of gendered politics that we normally think about in terms of suffrage, but think about the way collecting sometimes is political. So I just want to warn you that that's the direction I'm going to go today. So let's start out with getting my reading glasses on, first of all. And then secondly, hitting the slide. And I'm going to ask you the simple question, are women people? This was the question asked by American poet, playwright, and author Alice Duer Miller in 1914. She would continue to ask and answer that question through 1917. The question was the title of her New York Tribune column, in which Miller deployed her writing talents to fight for American women's right to vote. So popular were her columns that Miller's question, are women people, formed the initial part of a book title. The second half is A Book of Rhymes for Suffrage Times. It was published in 1915. Miller poked fun at those who stood against women's suffrage. One of the selections in Are Women People is one that Miller had published in 1914, and that satirically substitutes pockets for votes. Let's take a quick look, at the political humor in Why We Oppose Pockets for Women. And while we're at it, let's add some of the era's images based on that humor. So the first reason Miller gave for anti-suffragists, why we oppose pockets for women, was because pockets are not a natural right. Anti-suffragists argued that voting was a privilege and not a right, even though the United States Constitution uses the phrase, the right to vote. So here's this wonderful little cartoon about pants are made for men and not for women. You can see here that what's going on, again, is that term pocket is taking the place of vote. Why we oppose pockets for women? Because the great majority of women do not want pockets. If they did, they would have them. Because women do not vote, they do not vote. That's the argument being put forth there. And when we say because whenever women have had pockets, they have used them, we're actually looking at a moment when women actually did vote in some areas in 1914, 1915, especially for local school board elections, which was thought the moral thing to do. Women were more moral than men. Women were in the domestic sphere. Women had the children and cared for them. Of course, they could have voted for school board elections. This anti-suffragist argued was well within women's sphere. So when they have the vote, they've used them and they don't need anything more than that. Here's another one. Why we oppose pockets for women? Because women are required to carry enough things as it is without the additional burden of pockets. And I included this wonderful suffragette series here because she's carrying, first of all, a beautiful reticule, but second of all, her burdens are now her husband's. When we think about carrying enough things as is, we also think about caring for everything that we have, and including everybody we have, including children and the home and all that goes with it. Another why we oppose pockets for women, because it would make dissension between husband and wife as to whose pockets were to be filled. And there were plenty of cartoons about this one. Next, why we oppose pockets for women, because it would destroy man's chivalry toward woman if he did not have to carry all of her things in her pockets. This is one of the few images of African-American women in the suffrage movement, and the burdens are many. Jim Crow, segregation, the grandfather clause for voting. And so when you think about, destroying man's chivalry toward women, what we should be reminded of is that for suffrage, for the suffrage movement in the early 20th century, it was about white women. It's something we really do need to keep in mind as we go forward here. Let's see. Why we oppose pockets for women? Because men are men and women are women. Must not fly in the face of nature, right? This kind of says it all, right? So to give women more power is to basically go against the natural order of things. And you see this here in both of these images. The girls are doing all the fellows' jobs now, and having this and basically feminizing men by having them adopt the maternal roles in the household. Because pockets have been used by men to carry tobacco, pipes, whiskey flasks, chewing gum, and compromising letters, we see no reason to suppose that women would use them more wisely. And this was another trope on both sides of the Atlantic in the United States and in England, as women suffragists and suffragettes in England were fighting for the vote. It's fascinating to think about the separate spheres argument and that we're just trading roles rather than kind of thinking about a new way of being. But this was the argument that anti-suffragists really put forward, that there are innate differences between men and women. Men are inherently problematic and evil, and when they want to do bad, they'll do bad. And so they will smoke and they will swear and they will drink alcohol and they will chase women and they will do other things. And if women could, we don't want women doing that, right? And so this is another perfectly sensible reason, evidently, for not getting the vote. The objects in men's pockets, not the safe ones such as handkerchiefs or card cases or money, but rather the vices represented in tobacco, whiskey, and gambling, really do a lot of heavy lifting here. And we're going to see that when we discuss women's pockets. When it came to dress, men's clothing had to be functional. Women's dress was decorative, reflecting the wealth of their husbands and for their husbands' pleasure, something the sociologist Thorstein Veblen observed in his 1899 theory of the leisure class. Another suffragist, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, wrote in 1905, "One supremacy there is in men's clothing is its adaptation to pockets. Women have from time to time carried bags, sometimes sewn in, sometimes tied on, sometimes brandished in the hand, but a bag is not a pocket. No surprise Gilman took this stance. She was raised in part by her great aunts Harriet Beecher Stowe and Isabel Beecher Hooker." Gilman continues, "If your bag be small and hold but a few things, it is of little use. If it be large and hold many things, there is trouble in finding the article wanted. Pockets, in the masculine sense, are trim, flat, vertical pouches, keeping their shape in place so that the accustomed hand can fly to them instinctively. The man's pockets remain alike in size, shape, and position, while their clothes change around them. In their number and variety come that easy carriage of small articles which add so much to the preparedness of men as compared to women. At the time Gilman was writing, the well-dressed man boasted 15 pockets in his pants, vest, jacket, and overcoat. One could also count the inside band of his hat as a pocket. Preparedness was more than having what you needed at hand. It was a way of being mobile, independent, and free in the world, physically, socially, politically, economically, and culturally. For second wave suffragists, wearing pants and men's clothing in general connected these traits to the pocket. Here's Gilman again, imagining in a 1914 fictional story entitled If I Were a Man, what it felt like to wear men's clothes. She writes about a protagonist finding herself transformed into her own husband and goes about his day. Of course, she had known the pockets were there. She had counted them, made fun of them, mended them, even envied them. But she had never dreamed of how it felt to have pockets. Behind her newspaper, that odd mingled consciousness roved from pocket to pocket, realizing the armored assurance of having all those things at hand, instantly get-atable, ready to meet emergencies. The cigar case, the firmly held fountain pen, the keys, pencils, letters, documents, notebook, checkbook, bill folder. Notice all this about money. All at once, with the deep rushing sense of power and pride, she felt she had never felt before in all her life, the possession of money, of her own earned money, hers to give or to withhold, not to beg for, tease for, wheedle for, hers. So this is all very interesting. So what we have is the pocket as a way of being prepared, of signifying votes, of signifying power, of signifying economic independence. So let's go back a bit and look at the pockets that Charlotte Perkins Gilman and other of her generation of suffragists were referencing. And let's do a short history of the pocket. European women of all classes have been making and using detachable pockets for centuries. Sewn-in pockets began to appear in men's garments in the late 17th century. Women improvised pockets sometimes, made by converting a shawl or an apron or part of a skirt into a temporary container with which to gather or carry objects. Women depended on some pockets in their accessories, but overall relied on tied-on pockets. And that's what you see in this lovely image where the woman is picking up her overskirt and there's her petticoat underneath, and in between she has a pocket where she's carrying probably some money as well as some other stuff for this temptation of a fruit stall for all these children. Tie-on pockets were worn on top of clothing or wore under skirts, but over and amid their petticoats if they wore more than one, to provide the necessary catch-alls for the tools of daily labor, money, and other possessions. Untied from the body, these cloth receptacles serve neatly as storage. To compare them to sewn-in pockets is to overlook their versatility, though. These pockets could be large or small, worn singly or in multiples, and taken off when resting. Think about the fanny pack back in the 80s and 90s, and you kind of get the idea of what they're trying to get at. As Barbara Berman and Ariane Fenitow point out in their recent history of the pocket in England, tie-on pockets were functional, not fashionable, and a study of extant examples tells a different story than the fashion industry historically has told. Rather than being replaced in the late 18th century by small bags called reticules, something we'll talk about in a minute, tie-on pockets continue to be made and used. Examples dating to the late 19th century exist in American museum collections, proving their historical utility to women. The shape of detachable pockets could be changed to adapt to any fashionable silhouette. And over the course of the 18th and 19th century, we go from very straight styles to wide styles and back again. So the pockets kind of adapt to that. The history of fashion is more often based on change evident in the overall garment silhouette. the history of fashion tends to ignore temporary additions to garments as well as what was worn underneath them. So if you went to a history of fashion, a fashion museum that kind of didn't think about social history, but thought about more aesthetic value, like artistic value, you'd be seeing different silhouettes of breasts and mostly, outer garments rather than underwear. What's great is now that fashion is really turning to more social and cultural history. And here at the Victoria and Albert Museum, you see this example of a pocket and this is a late 18th century costume. And you see how the pocket was worn on the hip. Now, these pockets could be worn all the way around. I mean, wherever you tie them on your waist, that's where they could be. And you could also tie it to your corset or to your stays. This may be why the notion of fashion rather than utilitarianism rather than function, this may be why museums more often have elegantly embroidered pockets in their collection. Other reasons, of course, include family history with the object handed down from one generation to the next, or that a given pocket was a worthy example of the decorative art of embroidery. Historians argue that embroidered pockets were designed as gifts, but I think there may be another reason for embroidered pockets beyond the pride one would take in one's own skills. Perhaps, just perhaps, embroidered pockets were worn on special occasions. If you're using them, if you're out and about, you're at a social event with, your family or friends, right? A cotillion, a tea or something like this, you're not just wearing your pockets in your house, right? As we've seen. So while I was gathering images of all these lovely women's pockets for this presentation, I stumbled upon some designs for men's waistcoats. And I now wonder whether embroidered pockets acted like a bit like embroidered waistcoats. That is to say, men's waistcoats were rarely seen in full, right? You would have a coat over it if you were at a social function. Similar that you would have a skirt over your pocket, but that it may be revealed from time to time if you had to, get out a piece of paper and a pen, whatever have you, a handkerchief, for example. So what was correct in social gatherings? So I think looking at the etiquette of how to use these, which is difficult to find, you would have to find it in diaries, for example, may lead us to a different interpretation of the pocket. So, and that asks another question. Once we get these lovely printed cottons in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, do they take the place of embroidery, and are those the fancy pockets and not the everyday pockets? We're not sure, and again, that would have to be the issue of looking into who the maker was, what the cost was, and trying to come up with some snappy solutions to those questions. We just need more research on women and women's stuff, just generally speaking. Women have fewer examples of 19th century tie-on pockets. This does not mean that there were fewer women who used them. The first appearance of a pocket pattern, and I just want to show a nice plain one here. So I think this is just lovely because you can see the wear on this and also the fact that it was stored for such a long time. So the first appearance of a pocket pattern in print occurred in 1838. When the Workwoman's Guide, containing instructions to the inexperienced in cutting out and completing those articles of wearing apparel, etc., which are usually made at home, was published in the United States and in England. It is interesting to note this title with its mention of what is usually made at home versus what may be made by others for purchase. Of pockets, the author wrote, pockets are either worn tied around the waist, fastened into the petticoat, or buttoned upon the corset stays. When fastened into the petticoat, they are made of the same material, otherwise of dimity, calico, jean, twilled muslin, and sometimes nankeen and brown jean. So here for the first time, we get a sense of how people are making these. and who is making them, and because we could go with those fabrics and try to figure out how much they cost and what kind of class of women would be able to afford this material and have the skills to make them. So I just want to show a couple of these handmade ones that I found. This one's pretty spectacular, from Pennsylvania, with these wonderful fabrics. And then something a little bit plainer, just a linen pocket, you know, in these wonderful beiges and blue and white stripes. Now, this is not to say, on the other hand here, right, that women's costumes, women's garments, women's dresses in the 19th century did not have pockets. There seems to be an either or situation going on. We went from having tie-on pockets, and then we had, you know, set-in pockets sewn into clothing, or the clothing was styled such that we couldn't do a tie-on pocket, so we had to carry a purse or a reticule or something like that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and that's okay, right? Conservator Margaret O'Neill finds pockets in the extant women's costumes she looked at, placed in a wide variety of places over the course of the 19th century. Remember that women, especially in the growing middle class after the Industrial Revolution, did not go to ready to wear, right? They still had their costumes, their garments made for them. And, you know, especially their going out dresses, their social dresses. And they could tell a seamstress, right, where to put a pocket in, you know, underneath, you know, into a skirt or underneath a bodice or something like that. So they still exist. Why suffragists would rue the lack of pockets is both a reflection on the rise of ready-made and couture clothing in which pockets were additional expenses, and the fashion during the 1890s through the 19-teens of hip-hugging skirts and the use of handbags. So there's some myth-making going on here that, you know, everybody wore these pockets before then. Then there's what we are today making, the reticule, sometimes called the reticule, which I find fascinating. This type of bag or purse appeared as a fashionable accessory at the end of the 18th century. Reticules, there we go. And it had thinner, it basically complemented the thinner column-like dress that was really fashionable in Europe and in the United States at the time. It also had, the dress also was made of thinner fabric, a higher ampere waist, and a straight gown. Although some fashion historians argue that this dress made tie-on pockets impossible to wear, that's actually not true. Rather, the pockets could become longer and flatter to accommodate the new silhouette, right? So this was a choice. So we do have historical dresses that have the tie-on pockets underneath this kind of, you know, column-like dress. But here we see a fashion plate in which the woman is carrying a reticule. And I reprint the 1838 figures here because the shape of the reticules really follow the different figure 10 and figure 11 of the pockets. So there's some correlation here that I find fascinating. Reticules were fashionable accessories early on. The fact that they were taken out and displayed where other pockets were either hidden and sometimes displayed is an important distinction. They were originally made of netting, but this extended to other more sturdy textiles, including silk, satin, and velvet. Reticules had drawstring closures and were carried on the wrist on a cord or a chain. Many women made their own reticules, adding embroidery and beading, like this lovely one by Martha Kittredge. Some considered the reticule, though, as a version of a pocket that was, you know, when you think about it, tie-on pockets are more closer to the body. So they were considered underwear. So early on, some folks actually disliked reticules because they saw them as vulgar, right? As reminiscent of where the pocket used to be. Nevertheless, popular domestic magazines such as Godey's Ladies Book carry designs for reticules almost every month. advertising the fashion throughout the United States for over 30 years. There seemed to be a distinction between reticules and purses until after the Civil War in the United States. Reticules were bags that carried a whole host of items, even food. There are a lot of stories about going into a mother's or grandmother's or a sister's reticule and taking out a piece of cake. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. So reticules were kind of catch-alls and carry-alls, but purses, when they use the term purse, it was a smaller item that was really meant to carry money, carry currency. So here are some pages from different years from Godey's Lady's book. You could see the basket reticule, pointed reticule, and then a braided reticule. And what I find really fascinating about these is that they are indeed fancy work. They take up a lot of time, they show off your skills, and they're meant for decoration and display, as well as this utilitarian purpose. It's something to keep in mind. The American Girls book, written by Eliza Leslie and published in 1854, also featured an entire chapter on reticules. The instructions tell us much about what girls knew about sewing and decoration, or at least what Miss Leslie thought girls were supposed to know. I just offered two here. There were so many of these. And you can just see they're almost as complicated as the ones that you see in Godey's. What's evident as you work through the pages of these books and journals is that the size of the reticule does increase over the course of the 19th century, becoming what we know today as handbags, and becoming both fashionable and functional in their purposes for storing work projects and for overall storage, right? So a reticule could be fashionable, it could be plain and you know, for your sewing or otherwise. So they did have multiple purposes. But these bags also had political purposes. Women's anti-slavery societies raised funds and raised awareness by taking everyday objects such as quilts, pot holders, pillows, aprons, cloaks, bags, inkstands, and other domestic goods, and reworking them for political purposes. Oh, I forgot about this. I'm sorry about that. This is a lovely 1842 painting by Joseph Whiting Stock. Mostly he painted folks in New England. And here is a little girl with a reticule. I just thought that was fabulous to add. And here we are now at the anti-slavery reticule I was talking about. This is made out of silk. This one is from England, made around 1830. And each featured a printed image of a slave on one side and a printed inscription on the reverse. The inscription reads, "Negro woman who's sitting pining in captivity and weepeth over thy sick child, though no one seeth thee, God seeth thee, though no one pitieth thee, God pitieth thee. Raise thy voice, forlorn and abandoned one, call upon him from amidst thy bonds, for assuredly he will hear thee." So it's interesting. This is English. And in 1833, England passed the Emancipation Act abolishing slavery in its territories. American abolitionists took many lessons from the English abolitionists, including imagery and objects. In 1837, women in the anti-slavery movement in Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia commissioned 100 pieces of silk stamped with these same designs, originally created by Samuel Lyons, to be reworked as reticules and work bags to help do the work of abolition. So again, another political purpose out of an everyday object. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up here a little bit. For early 20th century suffragists, the lack of pockets in their garments meant the lack of autonomy. To have pockets was to have agency, to be self-possessed. This correspondence of pockets and autonomy was strengthened because late 19th and early 20th century women's dress was more fitted around the hips, making it difficult to include pockets. Suffragists, quite frankly, weren't that happy about handbags either, but the focus was on emulating how men instantiated, symbolized autonomy through dress. For their grandmothers, reticules represented skill and knowledge of fashion, but their small sizes speak to ornament rather than to utility. Something, again, Veblen noted when he wrote about conspicuous consumption and women's roles to reflect their father's or husband's wealth and status. 19th century women's reticules were sometimes spectacular pieces of fancy work meant to be fashionable and functional, displaying makers' skills and talent. This pineapple reticule is one of my favorites. I have a knitting pattern for it. I need help with it, but this is just glorious. It's from 1810 and it's at the Kyoto Costume Institute in Japan. If you go on Ravelry, you'll find several patterns for this. It's just a fantastic, lovely piece. Little wonder that so many of these sort of amazing pieces have made their way into museums and private collections. The plain pockets also have made their way into museum collections. And it is interesting to note that the term pocket was derived from the Anglo-Norman French poke, meaning pouch. For many years, museums often used the term the donor called an object, and it is no surprise to find that what today we would call a pouch or sack was also called a pocket. So these, for example, in the Cooper Hewitt Museum are also called pockets. They're not tied around the waist. They're drawstring, very simple. They're pouches, right? They're sacks, they're pouches. That these everyday items of great and continuous use survive is remarkable. It is difficult to imagine how many plain pockets, whether intended to be tied around the waist or carried by their drawstrings, used daily, washed often, placed under pillows or hung from bedposts or chairs for safekeeping at night, and likely mended many times, would survive over a century or more. Yet these objects exist, each telling a story of survival through care, even if we do not know all the persons involved. This too is a political act when you think about it. For what stories we tell connect us one to another as a family, a community, and a nation. What all women wore and carried in the past is worthy of study. As Barbara Berman and Ariane Feneteau write, the pocket merits a close-up study in itself because what is small can recalibrate our visions of the large. Thank you.